Hi, everyone. It is with much excitement that I present our grand round speaker for today. Dr. Natalie Gukasyan is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Columbia University Medical Center. After receiving her medical degree from Tulane University School of Medicine, Dr. Gukasyan completed her internship and residency in psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. She went on to complete a NIDA T32 fellowship in behavioral pharmacology under the mentorship of Dr. Roland Griffiths, focusing on safety and efficacy of psilocybin-assisted therapy for people with mood and eating disorders. Before joining the faculty at Columbia, Dr. Gukasyan served as medical director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, where her research also spanned other clinical aspects of psychedelics, including placebo and psychotherapy effects in treatment, as well as medication interactions. At Columbia, she's working to build a program of clinical research in psychedelics and is also an attending clinician at the Interventional Neurotherapeutic Psychiatry Program, which offers ketamine and brain stimulation for treatment-resistant mental health conditions. Dr. Gukasyan has shared her expertise through impactful publications, talks, book chapters, and media interviews. We are very lucky to have her here today, sharing her expertise with us at UCLA, where she will be speaking about the role of psychiatrists in the coming and current psychedelic treatment landscape. Thank you to Dr. Gukasyan.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Thank you, Katrina, for that lovely intro. Very pleased to have been invited to talk with you all today about this really exciting time in psychedelics and I think in psychiatry overall. So without further ado, I'll get going. So just some disclosures. I'm a former co-investigator for a study funded by UCLA Institute. I've had salary support from these generous donors through the psychedelic and consciousness research back at Hopkins, and my current research salary support comes from the New York State Psychiatric Institute. So I hope to leave some time for what I hope will be a stimulating discussion, but by the end of today's talk, I hope that you can come away with a good understanding of the status of psychedelic drug development right now, as well as a lot of other avenues through which patients might access psychedelics, to understand the commonly used treatment approach and the research that has been done to date, and some associated limitations and opportunities, how this might or might not play out in the clinic, and to describe the future directions and the role of academic medical centers like yours, as well as psychiatrists in this sort of strange time that we find ourselves in. So by now, a lot of you are probably aware that there's a growing body of literature that shows that just a few doses of MDMA or psilocybin in a supported setting can produce a rapid and sometimes profound improvement in a variety of psychiatric conditions. And if proven safe and effective in larger studies, psychedelics might be a very attractive alternative for patients who've either had incomplete relief with their existing treatment or who would prefer not to take a daily medication or who maybe haven't even been in care at all just because what is out there hasn't worked for them. And there's variable excitement among clinicians and researchers right now, some of whom speculate that this has the potential to substantially change mental health care as we know it. You might have seen this headline in the New York Times a year or two ago that the psychedelic revolution is coming and psychiatry might never be the same, which is a little ominous and scary. But how exactly is it likely to change and where do psychiatrists fit in? How do we get ready? And that's what I hope to give you a very broad overview of today in this talk. So to briefly define some terms, classic psychedelics are those that function primarily via serotonin 2A agonism or partial agonism. So that's drugs like psilocybin and psilocin, LSD, mescaline, DMT. And there are other drugs, what we call non-classic psychedelics, that might have some overlapping subjective effects and even biological effects, but that function by other mechanisms. So these are amphetamine derivatives like MDMA, and MDA receptor antagonists like ketamine, other plant alkaloids like salvia, ibogaine. When I refer to psychedelics in this talk today, I mean drugs that can fit into either of these categories, but primarily we'll focus on psilocybin and MDMA as these are closest to being available in a clinic near you somewhere very soon. So I'll take you through the two major pathways through which access to psychedelics is increasing. So on one hand, you have the standard drug development pathway, federal rescheduling. This is the setting through which patients might have access through more or less standard clinical care settings. This includes MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, which might be available as soon as 1 to 2 years, psilocybin for depression and treatment-resistant depression, and ketamine products, which are available now both on and off label for a variety of psychiatric indications. And the second pathway involves alternative routes to access, often ones with a lot less or just non-existent regulations. So this is state and local legalization and decriminalization, religious use exceptions, both in America and abroad, international retreat centers that might sometimes function hand in hand with those religious use exceptions, and underground providers here at home, along with just people being able to buy psychedelics through their local or not so local dark web provider. And for a lot of these, a clinical diagnosis is not really needed. It might be that people who access psychedelics through these means won't necessarily be the same ones who come through the clinic. But in any case, we as providers should be familiar with all of these. So in the first pathway, there is one company seeking to approve MDMA for PTSD, and two companies looking to approve psilocybin for depression and treatment-resistant depression. And all three have received this breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA, which means simply that the FDA is committed to expediting the drug development process because they have been impressed with what they've seen so far in terms of safety and efficacy signals from earlier studies. I should note that there are many, many other entities, usually for-profit ones, that are in the space right now at much earlier points in the drug development pipeline, but it's really MDMA and psilocybin that are going to be shaping the next few years of this as the first products to come into the space or have potential to come into the space clinically. So I'll just briefly cover the very latest in these two areas. So for MDMA for PTSD, the company sponsoring this application and indication actually collected its last piece of phase 3 data back in November. That has yet to be published. The figure you see here is from a phase 2 study published back in 2021, in which patients with severe PTSD, so a CAPS-5 score of 35 or greater, were randomized to receive either 3 doses of MDMA or 3 doses of placebo in a supported setting, so along with quite a bit of psychotherapy. As you can see, there's actually significant improvement in both groups. The MDMA group had about a 10-point CAPS-5 reduction advantage over placebo at the 18-week primary outcome time point, and had about a twice as high rate of people no longer meeting criteria for PTSD compared to the placebo group. And this should just give you a little bit of pause, right? We actually see a huge amount of improvement in the placebo group, suggesting that probably there's a large contribution from the therapy provided together with these kinds of medications. And assuming that phase 3 results are similar, MDMA does have the potential to be approved for clinical use as early as 2024. The latest estimate is probably the later part of 2024 if things go as the developer hopes they will. In terms of safety signals, I'll say those are also pretty favorable here. There wasn't any notable worsening in suicidal ideation or severe adverse events in the treatment versus placebo group. And in psilocybin, I'll just highlight this study. So this is from the largest study to date looking at psilocybin for any sort of patients, but these were patients with treatment-resistant depression. So to qualify for the study, they had to have failed 2 to 4 medication trials in the current episode. And if they qualified, they were randomized to receive 25 milligrams here in blue, or 10 milligrams or 1 milligram of psilocybin, with the 1 milligram condition functioning essentially like a placebo group. And what they found was, I wonder if there was I don't know how to characterize how they felt about the results, but I guess we don't really know. But it was actually significantly less striking than what we saw in earlier, smaller studies of psilocybin for people with depression. So they did find significant efficacy in the 25 milligram group over the 1 milligram quote unquote placebo group at 3 weeks, which was their primary outcome. But they failed to see a significant difference in secondary outcomes, which included overall rates of treatment response at 3 weeks, as well as response at 12 weeks, which seems important, right? If we can't sustain a response, then is this really going to be a worthwhile treatment? So the other thing to note was that this study did raise some flags for safety concerns. So there were actually 3 documented cases of suicidal behavior, including 2 aborted suicide attempts in the high dose treatment group, as well as preparatory behavior in the high dose treatment group. And all three of those patients actually did have prior suicide attempts or self-injurious behavior. So they did have risk factors. But it's important to note that this didn't happen in the other treatment arms, and did raise some concerns among people who had been looking at this study. And it's important to know also that those people who had those adverse events were non-responders, so those people who did not seem to respond to treatment. So clinical trials are steadily progressing, and MDMA in particular might be available as soon as next year. And so what is clinical rollout actually going to look like in the event that these therapies are approved? Who's going to be doing the treatment? What training are they going to need? Those are very important questions. And there's actually no consensus to what those answers are. So there's no consensus on what training or what licensure ought to be required for psychedelic therapists. And therapist training in particular is actually likely to be a significant bottleneck for rolling this out. If you can imagine the total addressable market, to borrow some business speak, of people who might be interested or might be candidates for this therapy, for even just for MDMA for PTSD, that number might be in the millions potentially, right? And that would require tens of thousands, if not more, of well-trained therapists to administer that care. And so right now, MAPS, which is the company trying to develop MDMA, is pouring many resources into training in anticipation of meeting this need. Prescriber training requirements are actually going to be minimal. So when I'm referring to training, I mean for the therapists who are going to be sitting with patients, but for those who are actually evaluating people, trying to determine if they're fit or writing the prescription, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of very high requirements. And if you look at how ketamine in particular has rolled out so far, you might actually see what we're likely to see with psychedelics. So, which is that many of these clinics are actually led by anesthesiologists, emergency medicine providers, other folks from different specialties, many of whom might just be like burnt out and see a lot of lucrative opportunities in ketamine and have started all these clinics all over the place. They don't necessarily have a ton of formal mental health training, and many of them are gearing up to offer psychedelics in the years to come, assuming that it's going to be approved. Another important point, and we'll get more into this soon, is that it's not really clear whether payers are going to reimburse for the treatment model that's been used in research settings, including in those two studies that I just highlighted. And this is an important point, and I think it's really important to understand what this looks like and why it's important for our conversation moving forward. It's a little bit more about this model. What happens to somebody when they come to a place like Hopkins or a clinical trial center that's running one of these studies? And this is quite similar to what we noted in the previous two studies of how that actually worked. It wasn't just the medicine, it was all this other stuff on top of it. So participants undergo about a day and a half of screening procedures, and this is truncated down after the pandemic. It used to be longer. And if they appear to qualify, they undergo preparation. And in our studies, it's been about 6 to 8 hours of contact with two study facilitators all at once together, during which there's a process of rapport building, life review. In some cases, they use specific therapeutic modalities like CBT or motivational interviewing, an overview of the kinds of drug effects to expect, how to navigate those. Assuming preparation goes well, participants would move on to the actual dosing day session. So here is a photograph I use a lot in my talks, which is Mary Castellano and Bill Richards, two of our very long-term therapists, Bill and Mary, who really helped to launch the program at Hopkins with a fake patient in the default position for the day. There's actually not a ton of therapy that goes on during the session day, but both therapists are required to be there just in case, to support the person. We tend to encourage them to focus on their own inner experience while they listen to music and have eye shades on, so they're not really spending much time looking around. So really, it's a non-directive approach, but therapists are there to offer some support, and I'd say it's more common than not that they do have some support to offer. It's not that they're just sitting there saying nothing, but it requires them to be there all day, right? So that's kind of a high cost potentially. And then after those dosing sessions, of which usually there's 1 to 3 of those, there are multiple meetings with both facilitators in the days and weeks to follow. And the point of that is to review what happened on the dosing day, any interim changes people might have experienced, and to understand and incorporate any insights from that experience into their daily lives to help reinforce any positive changes that might have come up. There's a gradual taper of those meetings through about 6 to 12 months. But the bottom line is that there's a lot of psychotherapeutic support. So in our depression study that we ran at Hopkins, for example, I added it up and it's something on the order of like 17 or 18 hours of psychotherapy in total, if not more, for some patients who go through our study. And it's important to note that the larger studies have had lower levels of follow-up support, so that psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression study had, again, just one session and far fewer hours of support, which might have led to some of their reduced efficacy in part. So what does all of this cost? Well, for the model that's been shown to be effective in smaller studies, kind of a lot. So MAPS ran a cost analysis essentially of their treatment, which included, again, 3 dosing sessions with a lot of therapy. And the cost per participant was about $11,500 per patient. Really, it's not just taking a pill. More than 90% of this is actually clinician compensation, right? So covering staff time for multiple well-trained people is expensive. That's a very high upfront investment for insurance companies. But the authors of this particular analysis did note that payers should expect to break even at about 4 years, meaning that the overall benefit of what they believe MDMA to have over standard of care right now should actually lead to a cost savings over time. But that is something that they're going to have to take, I guess, to accept potentially, right, before they put in all of that money. That's a ton of expense for them. So an important point here about what we're likely to see is that care is probably going to be delivered by teams of mental health care providers. It's really not just going to be a standalone therapist or psychiatrist who's doing this. And a lot of the actual therapy is probably most likely to be led by master's level therapists because they, quite frankly, just don't cost as much and are more affordable for most people. And it's a way to save on costs, right? And in many cases, they're better therapists than many of us are. The screening, prescribing, and emergency medical coverage, on the other hand, are more likely to be those services covered by medical providers who have prescriptive authority, so MDs, DOs, NPs. And in the community, a lot of those might be mid-level providers, right? So even though psychiatrists might have a ton of interest in these therapies, like me and maybe some of you in the audience, they're probably actually not going to be likely to be sitting in the room doing much of this therapy most of the time. Like if you just think about your own hourly rate and multiply it out by, several full day sessions and many hours of preparation and integration, that's just a huge cost to patients. On the other hand, though, psychiatrists are probably well suited to lead such teams who might be delivering this kind of treatment, given their, we have a great knowledge of biological and psychological issues, risk management. We could adequately monitor for and manage adverse events, things like that. Is this 2-therapist model going to survive? I kind of doubt it, honestly, in part because it's so resource intensive. It would be such a limit to access. And it would be really unlikely for insurance payers to really cover those really high costs for 2 people. On the other hand, it has a really great track record, right? So the studies that use that 2-therapist model seem to have really good outcomes. It's probably safer. There are more checks and balances. You're less likely to have weird behavior in the room. There's not a 0% likelihood of, the therapists acting out in some really terrible way. It's also a model that's ideal for apprenticeship, meaning that if there are trainees in your institution, which I know there are, this is really awesome for them. I think of all the people who came through our lab at Hopkins, they really loved the opportunity to be in the room with experienced clinicians doing really incredible therapy with people. So alternatives to this might look like the following. So one is a single therapist, and this is rumored to be a design used in a soon-to-be launched phase 3 study of psilocybin-assisted therapy. Group therapy has been explored, and even though the costs up front do look lower, there's actually like a quite high administrative burden in coordinating many schedules of people to the point where it might not totally be worth it, actually. And a third option, which pharma companies and for-profit entities might be angling toward in a sort of grotesque race to the bottom, is having no particular requirement for a therapist at all. This has not been studied yet, but people are already talking about it. So this was a commentary published just last month in the Green Journal with the first two authors being the chief medical officer and a co-founder of the largest for-profit company seeking approval for psilocybin, asking if psilocybin does it need to assist psychotherapy, which led to some interesting conversation in the community and a lot of letters to the editor, which you might see soon about this. So you might see some more attempts, sometimes quite transparent ones, to chip away at the minimum standards of care due to therapy being such a huge bottleneck to profits and the people who are making these drugs. So it's not really clear also if or when payers are going to reimburse for psychedelic assisted therapy, even if it's approved. This is going to require the creation of new billing codes or CPT codes. It's a 2-year process that is already underway. So in July, two companies who are sort of at the forefront of all this jointly sought approval from the CPT editorial panel for some new billing codes for psychedelic drug monitoring services. And I personally haven't seen the details of that, but I don't know whether what sort of RVU structure, et cetera, that might entail. And though, MDMA and psilocybin are not even approved yet, the last several years have seen quite literally billions of dollars of investment, including investment in brick and mortar clinics that are already up and running, many of which are offering ketamine and esketamine right now to just keep the lights on and brace themselves for MDMA and psilocybin. Many of those do not accept insurance. A lot of them are very aesthetically pleasing places like this one here. And as you might imagine, it's not really clear that they're going to opt to take insurance, even if some payers do offer reimbursement at some point. So unfortunately, treatment might be limited to those with means in the very early days. And what about ketamine? There's just a brief mention of ketamine here. As many of you know, racemic ketamine is being used pretty widely as an off-label treatment for depression and other indications of the potential for rapid efficacy being shown in some smaller studies so far. And there's enough excitement about ketamine that there's actually, entire professional organizations like this one that have launched simply to provide space for those who focus their clinics on these services. Many of those clinics are, again, run by non-psychiatric providers. And, ketamine is a little bit different. There seems to be more of a basis showing for sort of a primary antidepressant effect coming from biological effects. The psychological aspect of treatment, any subjective effects, seem to have a less clear relationship with outcomes, but that hasn't stopped people from offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. The longer-term risks of ketamine are not well characterized. It seems that some patients do find it really effective, but unfortunately can't go very long without needing a booster dose of ketamine. So some might be receiving, a monthly or biweekly dose of ketamine indefinitely, and we don't really know what sorts of risks those people might carry for the kinds of improvements that they're seeing. But there's infusion therapy, so IV. The ketamine-assisted psychotherapy often uses sublingual or intramuscular ketamine, and esketamine intranasal is approved for depression and is offered at increasing numbers of clinics as well. What about other routes? So the last few years have seen tremendous levels of public and scientific interest in these drugs with glowing media coverage, right? And so this figure here is from a paper from a couple of my colleagues highlighting the hype cycle surrounding psychedelics. So right now we're probably somewhere in the area of this peak of inflated expectations. And on the way up to this, there's been quite a proliferation of other avenues through which patients might be able to access these drugs, which might have outpaced where we are with the scientific research, unfortunately. And for better or for worse, the ways that people can legally and illegally access psychedelics are increasing, and we as providers ought to be familiar with them. This is the latest map pulled just a few days ago from the Psychedelic Alpha website, which tracks state and local level decrim and legalization efforts. This is actually, I gave a similar talk back in February, and the number of states who are in this light blue or active legislation piece, so like people, they're sort of working the bill through Congress, et cetera, has, I think, really proliferated. So there were maybe only a handful of these states, and I think there's at least 10 to 15 new ones since I last did this talk, California included here. But most notable are Oregon and Colorado here, who have achieve legalization, with Oregon in particular being essentially, I was about to say they're about to roll out, but they have rolled it out, and so it's actually on the ground and available now. So again, Oregon is the furthest along. There was this ballot initiative passed back in 2020 to legalize the use of psilocybin mushrooms. And the Oregon Psilocybin Services Board, OPS, has now released guidance on the requirements for manufacturer, laboratory, service centers, and facilitator licenses. So that's all up and running and available. There are clinics offering this now. It's in the very early days of being open for business. And this thumbnail also is actually also a little bit misleading because it says psilocybin for medical use, but the Oregon has been very, very clear that this is actually not medical use, because that would require them to say that they have some basis for saying that. And we're actually still not there yet with the clinical trials, right? And another important thing to note is that they have approved the use of mushrooms, not synthetic psilocybin, which is what is used in all the clinical trials. And those mushrooms can be really variable in their psilocybin content. They're not especially shelf stable. There are many problems thinking about using them for people, clinical or not. And importantly, psilocybin is available without the need for any clinical diagnosis for what they're calling, again, supported adult use, not medical use or therapeutic use. And there are a number of concerns with this program, right? So the first is this question of whether or not this is therapy, right? Many people are reflexively believing that this is therapy, in part, I think, because early on, the people who developed this bill and who were excited about it specifically cited mental health issues in Oregon as a reason to do this, without really necessarily being concerned about where the evidence was to support that, right? And if we're talking about mushrooms themselves versus the synthetic drug, the evidence really just isn't there. So they have to call it supported adult use. It's not therapeutic use. And another major concern is what sorts of safeguards, if any, are really going to be in place. So as far as I've heard so far, there's actually no clinical evaluation of any sort. There's a self-report form that people fill out, and a sort of disclosure signature page thing where people read about the potential risks. They have to indicate that they don't have any history of psychosis, no current suicidal ideation, no recent lithium use, because it's been contraindicated. We'll more on that later. And even those who are currently pregnant are not actually barred from using it. They just have to acknowledge that there are known risks with it. Interestingly, mania history doesn't seem to be present on the list of exclusions. And again, these are all based on self-reports, so there very well might be people who either do or don't know that they've had mania and just say that they don't, who might be able to access these kinds of services very soon. Facilitators is what they're calling them, not therapists, right? Who are working in Oregon are going to need a minimum of a high school diploma or equivalent to, and also to complete this 120-hour training program. That's standard. So you don't have to be a clinician. You never have to have sat with a patient in any setting. But yeah, you can imagine, right, given all of the hype around psychedelics about the silver bullet that it might be for various mental health reasons, there's going to be a huge influx of people who are going to be interested in this precisely for therapeutic use, many of whom have significant and complex mental health needs. We also don't know whether there are going to be safety nets in place for people who really have poor outcomes, meaning the people who have precipitated psychosis or mania or other kinds of severe destabilizations in their mental health. Or we don't know that anything beyond the emergency room is going to be available to them. In California, you guys are getting closer, right? So this is not far behind, but I do wonder whether issues in Oregon might put a damper on the enthusiasm about state level initiatives like these soon. In terms of international news, this made headlines in the last month or so. Australia has decided to go ahead and say this is okay for medical use, right? So not this whole, supported adult use pitter patter around what this is. They've gone out and said, like, we want to make this more available for clinical use. It's more rigorous than what we're looking at with other states in America that I've just covered so far, in that people have to apply to an ethics board. Hopefully we'll have to demonstrate they have the appropriate training and facilities to do this. It's going to be approved on a case-by-case basis, and people will need to have a a GMP manufactured product and not just psilocybin mushrooms. The changes in legislation have also been accompanied by some of the previously underground therapy coming to the surface. And here's one way this is happening. So this is from a company called, looks like Psychedelic Passages. These are sitters or therapists who are offering their services to sit with you or to guide you. They can come to you. They're located in the green state. They can come to the purple ones. Here they offer a ceremonial package, which includes some microdose coaching, which is really not evidence-based. And all this can be yours depending on your level of income, from anywhere from $1,500 to $4,000. Retreat centers have also been proliferating. So programs are in places like the Netherlands, Jamaica, Costa Rica, places that are more permissive of the use of psychedelics and psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca. A growing industry. And there's places like Retreat Guru, kind of like a hotels.com for retreats that have coordinated or booked retreats for hundreds of thousands of people and counting. And at retreat centers, the group therapy is more or less standard, the group therapy approach. Not all have physicians or mental health providers on site, but many of them do. Many retreats have really beautiful resort-like accommodations, but it is usually quite expensive, so usually thousands of dollars to participate in the experience. And those usually last anywhere from a day to a week, and then people go back home and probably don't have a ton of associated support going forward unless they're already in care with somebody. But again, a lot of those people might not be totally familiar with psychedelics or how to work with folks who've come out of those experiences. Religious exceptions, another interesting area. So psychedelics have had a role in ceremonial and religious use for millennia in some cultures, right? And though the Controlled Substances Act outlawed psychedelics in the States, there are actually some broad exceptions to this law. In 81, an exemption was granted to the Native American Church for ceremonial use of peyote. Later, an exemption was also granted to the UDV ayahuasca church, which originated in Brazil, but has branches in the US, and organizations can petition the government for a formal exception here. There are numerous other psilocybin or ayahuasca churches that are run in an underground fashion, and some straddle the border between church and retreat, being a little bit vague in what it is they're actually offering. In terms of underground therapists, we don't really know how many are out there actually. So this pictured here is Leo Zeff, who was touted as a pioneer. He's now deceased. He was a therapist working mainly with LSD and MDMA in the Oakland area. We don't have a ton of data on how many underground therapists are out there who are just offering this to patients, in their private practice. My guess is that they number probably in the thousands, especially from many of the folks who I met at a recent very large conference of psychedelic assisted therapy providers and enthusiasts. Maybe some are here in the room with us today. And finally, it's actually quite easy to obtain psilocybin in the US. So this is a picture from the exhibit hall at that conference. This is the MAPS conference in Denver a few months back. I wandered around the exhibit hall. I talked to a bunch of the people offering, psilocybin microdoses and products, and they more than one enthusiastically told me that they will ship to all 50 states. And so it's actually quite easy. So there are ways for patients to get this, and non-patients, everybody, that are actually not that difficult and probably don't cost thousands of dollars. There's also, many people are also offering ways to grow your own psilocybin, and that's actually technically legal, given that psilocybin spores don't contain any, psilocybin mushroom spores don't contain any psilocybin, and the growth media obviously is not illegal. It's just sterilized grain, so it's quite easy to get your hands on this. All this is to say that the use of psychedelics is rising, right? And so this is data from Monitoring the Future survey showing rates of hallucinogen use in the US among young people is essentially at an all-time high after being on the rise for the last several years. This doesn't include data from the last couple of years, but over this period here, MDMA use actually went down while psilocybin LSD has gone up, with 8% of young adults reporting past year use, so pretty high. So in this landscape, with psychedelics being available at every turn, sometimes in very cushy, beautiful spa-like facilities or through the mail even, how and what can psychiatrists contribute? So I will make an argument that I think there's actually quite a lot we can offer, and that we're going to have a crucial role. And I'll start with just some data from our waiting list controlled study of psilocybin for depression that we completed at Hopkins. This was published a couple of years back. We enrolled 24 people who were randomized to either immediate treatment with 2 doses of high-dose psilocybin or delayed treatment after 8 weeks. So they got nothing except phone check-ins here, and then later went on to receive psilocybin. So we had a pretty sizable response to treatment, so an effect size of about a Cohen's D of 2.5, which is really high relative to SSRIs. But again, this is a very small study with an imperfect design. And we eventually sort of grouped all those people together because they did get the same treatment at some point, either immediately or in the delayed group, and found that the mean improvements in depression at 3 through 12 months remained quite substantial, with Cohen's D's ranging around 2 to 2.5. So this is obviously an encouraging finding, right? Suggesting that psychedelics might have some durable benefits for people suffering with depression. And so indeed, we found that the rates of treatment response and remission remained quite high throughout this entire follow-up people. So all in all, good news, but it does come with some caveats, mainly that a lot of things can happen over the course of 12 months, right? And so actually by the end of the 12-month time period, a third of participants reported that they had started using at some point some kind of antidepressant treatment. And about 40% of people had gone to therapy of some sort. Luckily, we didn't have any participants reporting psilocybin or other psychedelic use outside of the study, so that was not a confounder. But I think this is to say that, this is really probably not going to be a standalone treatment. We ran a few analyses comparing those who did and did not begin use of antidepressant during the follow-up period, and found that those who eventually went on to medication had higher baseline depression scores. They didn't seem to differ in other characteristics like sociodemographic characteristics, years of depression, duration of the current episode, or even whether they had used medication in the current episode. So half of them did not come to us on medication, and half had been using it recently. So another important question is whether additional psilocybin or dosing sessions or higher doses might be helpful to some or all these people. That's an interesting area for future research. So I'll now turn your attention to an issue that might affect a very large subset of our patients and their ability to benefit from this kind of treatment. So it's estimated that about 2/3 of patients who carry a depression diagnosis in the US are being treated with an antidepressant. But current antidepressant use has actually been exclusionary for most studies involving psilocybin or MDMA. And this is because of fairly limited evidence, but convincing evidence that these drugs can actually dampen the acute effects of both of these, psilocybin and MDMA. So those who were taking or recently taking it might have some problems with being able to actually get a treatment response. Some studies did allow drug tapering after enrollment. So some studies allowed people to come into the trial, but tapered them within the study. Usually have to be off for about 4 to 5 half-lives, but there's a growing body of data that shows that there might actually be residual effects that might persist beyond this window of that tapering period. So even if people have the drug out of their system, it might still cause a problem. This is an interesting study that we'll just make a note of here. So this came out of the lab of our colleagues who are now, or Card Harris actually now in California, right, at UCSF. This is back in Imperial, where they did a study comparing 2 high-dose sessions of psilocybin plus 6 weeks of placebo to 2 placebo sessions plus 6 weeks of escitalopram. So a kind of elegant design that's starting to get at the question of comparative efficacy, but not quite, right? Because these people actually got all the weird pomp and circumstance of the preparatory and session days, just without any active drug. So the authors actually failed to find a significant outcome difference in their predetermined or pre-registered primary outcome, which was the QIDS score at about 6 weeks. They did note a significant difference in basically every other measure of depression they looked at, but they happened to be kind of unlucky with choosing QIDS. So But in general, as you could see, the numbers tended to favor psilocybin, but again, did not reach significance for QIDS. So in a secondary analysis of that study, the authors actually found that those who tapered off antidepressants when they came into this study had numerically less improvement when treated with psilocybin. So when they limited the analysis to those who had not tapered off of medications, the difference between psilocybin and escitalopram groups did reach significance with QIDS. Essentially showing that even if you had come off of your antidepressant, if you had recently been on one, you really don't seem to have any significant improvement with this kind of medication, with psilocybin. And similarly, Fiducia and colleagues found similar results when they analyzed data from 4 studies of MDMA for PTSD. So improvements in PTSD and depressive symptoms were significantly lower in those who had recently tapered off of a drug. You can see that here in their primary endpoint. The CAPS-4 score, the difference is pretty staggering, right? So there was maybe a 20-point improvement in the group who had tapered compared to about a 40+ point improvement in the non-taper group. If you look at those who stopped meeting criteria for PTSD, again, the rate is much higher in the people who had not been on a medication. And similarly, the depression scores had a similar kind of trend. And so the mechanism for this isn't totally clear. It probably has something to do with the effects of longer-term SSRI and other serotonergic drug use on serotonin receptor density. And then it might just take some time for this to happen. But there's been some sort of interesting developments. This is actually a very recently published study from the Compass group in which they did not taper patients off of the medication before they gave them psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And they found essentially what was quite comparable levels of improvement to what they saw in that controlled study that I showed you in the very early part of this talk. Like the numbers were almost identical, but this was an open label study, which is important to note. And one way that we might explain this, right? Like, well, I thought we had dampened effects even after psilocybin or even after medications were tapered, is that these people actually were treatment resistant, right? So they had recently received antidepressants, and there seems to be some evidence that actually recently using those drugs might have an effect here. And we did a survey study on this. It was also just recently published, trying to understand what happens in naturalistic users of psilocybin when they take it after they take themselves off of antidepressants. So we ran this survey where we asked people who used psilocybin at some point after they stopped their medication, what sort of effect did you have? Was it about the same as expected, lower, more intense than expected? And so we actually found that the rates of people reporting reduced drug effects, so lower than expected drug effects, tapered off at this kind of a steep level, but there was significance until the 1 to 3 month time point. So there might be some residual effects that last at least 1 to 3 months after people stop their medication. So this has obviously potential implications for dosing, for optimizing treatment in patients with recent antidepressant use, which is a huge chunk of our patients. And this is an area for us to explore in further research. We published another notable drug interaction that we identified via analysis of online trip reports, meaning people go online and write about what happened to them in their drug experience. We had this question about mood stabilizers because we were interested in designing a study for people with bipolar depression. And we wanted to know, could we potentially minimize risk for precipitating mania if we gave psilocybin or other psychedelics to people who are currently on their mood stabilizer. And it was a good thing that we did this study to analyze the online trip reports, because we found that among 62 people mentioning concurrent lithium use, a huge percentage of them, almost half, reported having had a seizure or ending up in the hospital, or both, if they had used psychedelics, classic psychedelics, while on lithium. That was not true of lamotrigine, but this goes to show that there are really serious and potentially important clinical issues for us to consider and learn about that might be very crucial to our patients. So the bottom line is we need to do more research, and it's not a totally risk-free endeavor to do this. And I'll make a final note on this topic on some early observations from our study of psilocybin therapy for anorexia nervosa, which is a clinical population that has substantial medical and psychiatric comorbidity. So we found on average that people with anorexia reported lower levels of subjective effects compared to previous samples that we had looked at with depression or people who were healthy. And the outcomes have been highly variable, though on average they actually do seem to show significance, but some people really did great and others really did not seem to improve at all. Some participants returned to challenging home environments and require higher levels of support, even in some cases higher than we were able to offer in the study. So it's really not a standalone intervention that would be appropriate for every patient. And unlike mood disorders, improvement did not seem to happen overnight, which makes sense, right? Because even if you have some kind of big insight about wanting to recover and all the different changes you're going to make, you actually have to make those changes over a period of weeks and months. And if you have a person with anorexia nervosa, to really get them out of the state of starvation and malnutrition. So it's not an overnight kind of silver bullet. In some cases, that behavior change of changing your diet and activity levels can exacerbate anxiety and mood. Those people need additional support. And highly meaningful sessions did not always translate into this behavioral change. So in all, it just leaves me concerned for the prospects of facilitators in places like Oregon, right, who have really little experience potentially with working with folks of complex clinical presentations. So back to the question, right, in the title of my talk, right? So like, what can we actually contribute as psychiatrists? So I think there's a clear need for people with a strong knowledge base that can draw on a critical review of the evidence here to really make the best decisions for our patients. And as in other settings, right, psychiatrists may be best suited to provide the most comprehensive care for the most complicated patients. And, you know, for other applications, maybe other kinds of approaches might be appropriate, but probably less so for folks who don't have just garden variety depression or demoralization. And again, psychiatrists, I do think, are well suited to lead teams and integrate this treatment into existing systems of care. So the question then becomes, how do we prepare for all of this? And this is just to highlight an initiative we had going at Hopkins before I left, which I'm still involved in. We took a look at psychiatry program directors and what they were offering in terms of education on psychedelics. We found that ketamine was covered fairly commonly, but in general, psychedelics were not. Were covered at a lower rate. So about 40% of programs actually offered any education there. And this is probably skewed a little high because essentially the people who responded to this survey were probably a little bit more excited about psychedelics in general. And current offerings are mostly on the order of about 1 to 2 hours per for the whole program. They were interested in bumping that to maybe 3 to 5 hours of material. And the lack of educational materials was among the most cited barriers and concerns among program directors. So it seems like they just were not prepared to offer this kinds of stuff because this is a very new emerging paradigm. Maybe not the newest, right, but it's new this time around in the second wave of research. And so before I left Hopkins, and I still am involved in this initiative, we developed this tri-institutional working group funded by Hefter Research Institute. It's a partnership with Hopkins, NYU, and Yale, where we hope to have consensus on learning objectives and core competencies for psychiatrists and other providers who want to specialize in this. We hope to develop a set of initial materials and a framework for education, basically, that can span levels of training and probably would even be useful for people out of training. And finally, we hope to assemble a framework for clinical practicum, which seems to be a key component that many training programs out there don't offer. And we hope to pilot this at each institution here. So I'll just leave you with some areas of opportunity for psychiatrists at academic medical centers like yours and mine, right? So I think we can stand to leverage our expertise with clinical populations to really study the risk-benefit ratio here and to optimize care. We can collaborate with our basic and translational colleagues, public health experts, others to do this, right? And we can set a standard for clinical training beyond just online certificate programs that are also popping up like mushrooms, which includes supervised clinical practicum, which is really key, I think, to maintaining safety and quality for patients. And we can interface with our professional organizations to set reasonable clinical standards and to promote safe access to care. So in conclusion, This is a very rapidly changing area. I think not a day goes by that something new doesn't cross my desk that I learned about some new development, new legislation. But this is rapidly changing. The drugs are progressing through the development process. They might be available very soon. And while they're powerful tools, they probably are not likely to replace the entire toolbox that we use as providers. So, clinicians at minimum should be informed about the risks and benefits of psychedelics, because it's also likely that our patients might seek to obtain access through other means. And we really do have a lot of opportunities to set standards for comprehensive care involving psychedelics. So hopefully this leaves us with a little bit of time for what I hope will be a stimulating conversation. I just want to thank and acknowledge all the folks who I've worked with over the years at Hopkins, our funders, our curriculum team here, and my new home at Columbia and NISP. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much for the very informative talk. I'm hoping to have a high yield discussion over the next 9 minutes.
I think great.
I wanted to lead off with asking you, with all this hype and with places like Oregon and Australia kind of jumping into it, what are the fears that you have? What are the things that keep you up at night as we come close to seeing this enter our field?
Yeah, I mean, like as I covered, right, it's all over the news, right, that this is the new thing in mental health care, that people who've not found any relief from anything else are having life-changing results. And so people who are out there who are really struggling are seeing this and getting interested. And I get emails basically every day from people asking how they can get this kind of treatment, being confused about the current regulatory status about it. So I think when people hear that you can just go to Oregon, you don't have to be a resident to do it, and receive it, and you could be in the, under the watchful care of somebody, but not really understand they're not really a therapist. But those people are likely to do that without really getting a clear understanding of what the risks might be. And so I think it's possible that people might end up with the really severe adverse outcomes that we've managed to avoid in clinical research settings because of the thorough screening we do, right? So it's precipitation of like mania, psychosis, or even just worsening, like severe worsening of anxiety in some people who are more vulnerable and need more care, right? It just sounds like Oregon is not set up to do that right now. I'm open to being pleasantly surprised, right? Because a lot of people who are seeking the training, the 120-hour training, are actually therapists and maybe can provide that kind of more comprehensive care. But there also doesn't seem to be much in the way of safety nets for people who don't achieve the kind of result they're wanting and maybe actually become hurt by these drugs. So they're not risk-free.
Right.
And I don't know that there's enough emphasis on that in the news media coverage.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that worries me the most, is that there hasn't been enough study of the harms, and that the greatest percentage of the research has been kind of looking at the efficacy in very curated patient populations, right?
Right.
And so for example, patients with borderline personality disorder, from my understanding, they've been mostly excluded from these studies. And
right.
Do we have any sense of how we would guide a patient who had BPD who wanted to utilize these therapies?
I mean, at this point in time, right, if someone in the audience here has a patient who they think is higher risk, right? I mean, the first thing is to applaud their talking to you about it in the first place, right? That they're willing to share that they have an interest in this and they want to do it, and you want to encourage them to continue to be open and honest with you as someone who's engaged in an ongoing process of care with them. So to encourage them to remain in care, have a really thorough discussion based around harm reduction, right, about what the risks might be, including what might happen if they take this kind of treatment if they're on lithium, for example, right? That could be a really serious risk for them, and have them understand that the results that are coming out in these studies are in the context of that really cushy, supportive framework, which might not be what they're going to be getting if they seek this kind of if they seek psychedelics through other avenues, right? But imagine, like, we probably some of those patients will do it anyway. And again, it will sort of come down to ensuring that they continue a relationship with you as their provider, and that you can help them should they run into some problems or consequences of that down the road. Maybe, for some, they might find some benefit from that potentially, but yeah, like I never actually I don't encourage anybody to do this if they ask me about it, just because the evidence is not really there for us yet.
Yeah. We have been asked if you could move the slide to your conclusions so that people can sit with those for a little bit longer. Perfect, thank you. And also someone asked if you had any speculation as to the mechanism by which lithium might increase and psychedelics might increase the risk of seizures.
We certainly speculated a lot in the discussion portion of that manuscript. Bottom line is we don't really understand. It seems that for some patients, lithium might increase risk of seizure. Period. Like, for example, there are some studies where those who got ECT and were recently on lithium were more prone to seizures. But we don't really have a great understanding of why that is specifically. Maybe some downstream sort of issue that happens with psychedelics that can affect or interact with what happens with lithium. But we should probably find out why, because that might be an important question.
Going back to the data regarding SSRI use and the effect that it might have on MDMA and psilocybin, I think I agree with you. I think that this is something that we're going to likely encounter quite a bit as psychiatrists. And so from my own looking into the literature, it seems as though it's the limited data that we have, and that it's like, did they recently taper off or not? Do we have any sense of whether or not the total amount of time that they spent on antidepressants has a factor? So I can imagine that someone who was on Lexapro 10 for 3 months before doing it, it would be different than someone who was on fluoxetine 60 for 25 years. But do we have any signal, or are you aware of any sense of whether or not kind of dose years would have an effect?
Yeah, so the data is not the highest quality, right? That came from a survey study, but we actually did look at that, and you can take a look at our paper about it. And we found something kind of surprising, I think, which is that folks who were on antidepressants for the shortest amount of time, like 1 month-ish before they tapered off, seemed to have more of a problem than those who had been on it for a long time. Looking at the dose was a lot harder, just because people don't really remember what doses they're on accurately, so we didn't even ask them, honestly. And it's hard to standardize that across drugs, right? So our survey included many different antidepressants, and there's just a difference in what those doses are, and equivalencies are kind of confusing. So we don't really have great data about the dose, relationship between dose and that sort of residual issue. But strangely, it's to our surprise, we didn't see that being on antidepressants for longer seemed to have much of an effect. Yeah.
Interesting. And anything that helps reverse it, or
not that we know. We looked at, we asked people, like, did you take a drug holiday, for example? And that didn't seem to sort of reduce that. Meaning, like, for people who had concurrent use, there was a 2-part thing to the survey. So people who were taking psychedelics while on an antidepressant. So a drug holiday didn't seem to help. We asked about taking additional doses. Off the top of my head, I'm having a hard time remembering if the additional doses of the psychedelic seem to do anything, but it might just be they need a higher dose potentially.
Yeah. I thought that the one slide that showed that use of psychedelics amongst young people is increasing was really interesting and scary, and not surprising. And I don't know if we have, do we have enough data or any data around the potential for what these compounds might do to the developing brain, someone who's in that range. I know that in the studies, they didn't have any, anyone under a certain age, I'm sure, but that kind of 18 to 25 range where we know that there's still pretty critical periods of neural development.
Yeah, so if you just look even before the last 5 years or so, the age group that was most likely to use psychedelics is this sort of like 18 to 25 group in the first place, right? They're more, they're exploring the world, they're taking drugs more often. And so there's always been kind of high levels of use in that group. There's some interesting data, a few papers published from kind of like ethnographic studies of people who, of adolescents and young children who actually use ayahuasca with their families in these ayahuasca churches in Brazil. And they didn't seem to show any issues with development or additional substance use that they could detect. They had like, same scores and neuropsychological testing and things like that. And even this is even with like repeated use. So some of these kids use it like many times a year over a period of years. But that's just one group, and that's like, people using with their family. It's very different than people who might just be out using MDMA or something with their friends every weekend. The bottom line is I don't think we have a great understanding of that. The one concern would be maybe a higher chance of precipitating mania in people who might be vulnerable and just haven't quite reached that time period where those symptoms might show themselves, right? And that's sort of like 18 to early 20s period where folks are at risk, but maybe wouldn't necessarily know it. So that would be a concern I would have for those people.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Well, I know that we're just 1 minute over. Thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise with us. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but thank you. Thank you again. And good luck in the next phase of things.
Thank you. Thanks for your attention. And it was lovely. I wish I could be there in person.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.